And welcome to Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co host, Ray Smith. Good afternoon, Ray.
Hi, Keith. How are you today?
I'm doing good, doing good.
Good.
We have our guest today, somebody that's no stranger to the viewers of Hidden
That's
History,
right.
Dr. Todd Ryder. And
Yes.
Ray, do you want to say anything about
I, I,
what
I'm,
Todd's
I-
going to be talking about today?
I'll talk just a little about it. Todd has been here before, and he has talked to us about the lessons from the forgotten creators. And we really have enjoyed learning that much of what we now know, and I often take for granted, came from these forgotten creators coming out of Germany. And he sent us a text or an email, I forget which, not too long ago, saying that he had some additional information he'd like to share with us. So we're glad to have you here, Todd. And just go ahead and give us your presentation, okay?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me back. I really appreciate it.
Mhm.
And the various accomplishments there at Oak Ridge during World War II and during the Cold War are a great example of revolutionary scientific innovation. So inventions and discoveries that really changed the world. And I was really interested in finding ways to improve revolutionary scientific innovation in the modern world. How can we get more innovation? And I decided to look at history and to see what has really helped to promote innovation at various places in the past. And of course, I could look at everything, but I didn't quite have time and resources to look at everything. So I had to narrow it down a little bit. And I narrowed it down really to two particular times in history. One is the US, that from 1940s to 1960s, there was really a golden age of innovation. And Oak Ridge was very much part of that. The rest of the nuclear program, Bell Labs, NASA, all things that your viewers are very familiar with. There was a second time that was really a golden age for innovation, second place, and that was the early German-speaking world. And people may be less familiar with that, so I'll spend a lot of time explaining that. I will go through these slides at about warp 8 or warp 9, but all these slides and a whole lot more is available on my website if anybody's curious. So in the earlier German-speaking world, this was from around 1800 to around 1945 in particular. There were a lot of revolutionary scientific innovators and innovations that were produced by whatever they had going on at that time. And so these were innovations in biology and medicine, in chemistry and material science, in earth and space science, in physics and applied math, in electrical engineering and optics, in mechanical engineering, in nuclear engineering, and in aerospace engineering. And I won't go into those today, so you can breathe a huge sigh of relief. If anybody's curious about those, I have several thousand pages in my book you can download for free from online that should keep you busy for a while. But I want to talk about really what was behind all this. Why did so many innovations come out of this early German-speaking world, and why did so many innovations come out of the US during the mid-20th century? Let me also define a few terms here. So the German-speaking world I'm talking about was not just Germany, but also the surrounding countries in Europe. They didn't always speak German, but that was the predominant language. So there were a lot of innovators and innovations that came out of this area. There was a lot of flow back and forth across these borders. And this is especially important, as I said, between about 1800 and 1945. Now, I don't want people to misunderstand me. So my study does not support nationalist bragging rights, ethnic bragging rights, the Third Reich. And I'm certainly not saying that this German-speaking world was perfect. Likewise, this doesn't claim that other places and times were not also good at innovation or shouldn't be studied. I think they should be studied. I mean, let's study all the innovation systems of history. Didn't quite have enough money to get there. So from these two innovation systems, the earlier German-speaking world and this golden age in the United States, I've identified what I think were really 10 major reasons why they produced so much innovation, certain systemic practices that they had. And so I'll step through these 10 different things. And for each one, I want to very briefly explain how the German-speaking world did it and promoted it, how the mid-20th century US did it and promoted it, and then how we could potentially do the same in the modern world to improve innovation nowadays. So the first one was cultural attitudes. And in the early German-speaking world, scientists were rock stars. It's really kind of hard to imagine this nowadays. Einstein is still the best known example, but there were so many others in physics, chemistry, biology, engineering, and these were, absolute public celebrities. Likewise, not just real scientists, but even fictional scientists in their books, in their movies, were regarded as intellectual heroes, held up as role models. Every kid should be like this. And to further encourage the kids, there were science clubs that got students into science. Here's a photograph from an early science club. This is a teenage Werner von Braun lugging his rocket around, his model rocket, back before he started aiming his model rockets at London. So that was the German world, and there were very similar things going on in the United States in the mid-20th century. Again, real scientists were regarded as intellectual heroes. They were constantly on magazine covers, named Person of the Year and everything. Again, it's kind of hard to imagine nowadays when, our idea nowadays of the Person of the Year is like just the latest teeny bopper or the latest sports star. Likewise, in the fictional works of this time, in books, in movies, scientists were intellectual heroes. If there's some great problem in the world, if the world is being attacked by giant mutant hamsters, then you don't call Superman, you call a scientist, and the scientist will fix it. Again, students were very much brought into this, encouraged in this by science clubs and by science kits, especially like A.C. Gilbert and Porter Chemcraft science kits. Some of these kits even had radioactive sources and Geiger counters that kids could play with on their own. Those are the good old days. So all those cultural attitudes could be implemented or improved nowadays in the modern world. We could begin certainly by elevating the social and the financial status of science research compared to, say, sports stars and pop stars and things. As you saw, the science kits were a very important part way back then. I think science kits nowadays could really help to encourage kids to get interested in science. And science fairs are a way that students can go beyond that and really learn how to do research on their own. We should also, of course, improve the salaries and the working conditions of the people who teach the science students, all the science teachers out there. And I think we should give much more media coverage to important scientific discoveries and to the people who are responsible for them, again, compared to the attention we lavish on other things in music and sports and so forth. The second factor was the funding levels. So this is for the German-speaking world, and on the vertical axis, there's a semi-log plot of how much money they were spending on science research, and it's in constant value, Deutschmarks versus time. And you can see that funding increased on this semi-log plot, funding increased exponentially for essentially a century and a half. Imagine that exponential increase in funding for a century and a half. And during that time, the funding essentially doubled every 14 or 15 years. That means that over the average, say, 40-year career of a scientist, by the time they retire, funding would have increased by about a factor of 6.8. And in turn, that means that for that retiring scientist, there's enough money to hire 6.8 new scientists. So you constantly have room for new scientists. And of course, there was even more room because so many of the scientists were able to go overseas and start careers there. Very similar, something here in the United States in the mid-20th century. There's an exponential increase in science funding during World War II. There was another exponential increase in science funding during the early Cold War. And yet after that, funding levels dropped and have remained fairly flat since then. So if funding is abundant, if there's an exponential increase in funding, then there's much more freedom to support revolutionary innovators and revolutionary innovations. And if funding is limited, then it really discourages innovation. There's great pressure that every dollar you spend has to have a guaranteed payoff, has to have a short-term payoff, can't be long-term. You can't take any risks with it. So I think that nowadays, those lessons could be implemented. Now, obviously, exponential funding increases can't continue forever, but the most important part of that was that there was enough funding for all the scientists to do their thing. And I think we need to do a better job nowadays of matching the amount of funding and the permanent job positions to the number of scientists, the number of graduating students. So increase funding wherever possible, and if necessary, maybe even think about birth control of how many students are going into science. But if you do that, then most scientists, once they get their degree, once they're working, could actually spend most of their time and energy doing productive science research and not have to spend so much time and energy chasing elusive funding and chasing elusive positions.
Yeah.
And then, if there were that freedom, if there were enough funding, then the sponsors, the institutions that hire these scientists would feel less pressure that it's okay to have a scientist who's working on something long-term instead of short-term. It's okay to have a scientist working on something that may not work out. That particular project may not work, but a different project will change the world. So it'd be much more freedom to support innovative research. The third point is the mentoring style. And in the early German-speaking world, there was a very particular style of mentoring, and this was described in biographies by a number of people who were educated and worked in the system. And they all describe how wouldn't just kind of take them on as slave labor in the professor's labs, but the professors wanted these German-speaking students to learn how to think for themselves, learn how to come up with their own ideas, how to pursue their own ideas. And the professors would teach them how to do that, but then kind of leave them on their own to do that. And this is described by Leo Szilard, a very famous scientist who came to the US. Michael Polanyi was a polymath. And you can read similar accounts in so many biographies from people. Now, in contrast, if you look at biographical accounts of mentoring in the United States, even during this golden age, there are so many people who say, well, my professor wouldn't really give me enough freedom to do my own interests. My professor just wanted me to help with whatever the professor's own interest was, and just be a trained monkey in the lab, adding to the professor's own CV. And here is one particular example, but there's so many. This is John Bardeen. He ultimately went on to win 2 Nobel Prizes, not one, but 2, one for the transistor and one for superconductivity. And so he describes how back when he was a PhD student, he was shopping around for a thesis advisor, and he to the American professors, and the American professors just all wanted him to, come help fill in some small space in the professor's own book that they were writing. But then he talked to some of these refugees from the German-speaking world, and they very much encouraged Bardeen to think for himself, come up with his own ideas. They taught him how to find the best ideas, how to find the best approaches. And I think that ultimately led to his success. So I think we could implement that sort of mentoring nowadays. If you think about a parallel, think about people who are training to be Olympic gymnasts or people who are training to be concert pianists. They train from a very early age how to do that. They're just constantly practicing their gymnastics from age 4 or whatever. On the other hand, with scientists, you want very creative, self-confident, self-independent scientists. And yet we don't teach kids how to do that. Usually you don't get to do that until you're, fairly old as a scientist. You finally have an established position and funding. By analogy, it'd be like expecting a gymnast just to sit on the sidelines until very late in life. And okay, now you're 45, now you can go out there and do gymnastics for the first time at the Olympics. It just doesn't make sense.
No.
So I think teachers and research advisors should encourage students to pursue their own ideas, teach them how to do that, give them the freedom, and if at all possible, not simply use the students as unpaid or low-wage labor for whatever the professor's own interests are. In fact, since students are quite cheap, if there were a company or a foundation or a government agency that had a little money, it'd be quite easy to round up some of the most promising young students and just grant them the free time and the resources to pursue their ideas and give them, minimal guidance on how to do it, make sure they don't blow themselves up. But you could really change the world with a group of students like that. The fourth factor is the average age at which people finally finished their university studies and started doing research as a job. And in the early German-speaking world, if you look for Nobel laureates, but also people who didn't win Nobel Prizes but did important things, the average age at which people did this, finished their degree, if they weren't delayed by war or something, was around 22 or 23, depending on whether it was a PhD or an MD. So think about that. You're 22 or 23, you get your doctoral degree, you get a permanent job, and you get the ability to pursue your own ideas. It's almost unimaginable now, but there were so many people who could do it in this place and time. Now, if you look at the same data for the United States during the mid-20th century, the average ages were a little older, around 25. So they lost a couple of years compared to their German-speaking counterparts. But still, this is young by modern standards. And they didn't have to go do 3 postdocs after this either. So at age 25, they can immediately go implement their own ideas. Nowadays, according to latest data, the average age graduation with a PhD is around 31 or 32. And even after you get that PhD, you have to spend quite some time doing internships, doing postdocs, and before they finally trust you with the keys. And so if you look at the average age at which people get their first government funding grant, this data is available for the National Institutes of Health, NIH. And the average age for the first NIH grant is between 43 and 46. So again, think about Olympic gymnasts who are not able to actually go out and do gymnastics until they're 43 or 46. You wouldn't expect them to be very good at it. So I think that we should reduce as much as possible the average age at which scientists get their final degree and get independent funding. Ideally back to where it was before, to early to mid-20s, but at least as low as possible. And that can be done if you eliminate certain redundant steps in education and things like postdoc slavery. And if you do that, you're not only giving more years to scientists to be productive, but you're giving them their most productive years. So an extra 10 or 20 years when you're in your 20s and your 30s, it's when you have the greatest creativity, the most energy, the fewest non-research obligations. And so I think this is a huge factor in why there were so many revolutionary innovators back earlier and not so many nowadays. The fifth factor is interdisciplinary work. And in the German-speaking world, there was a very long tradition of having people who worked in multiple fields, studied multiple fields, made major innovations in multiple fields. This was true even before 1800 and certainly countless cases after 1800. It was a rather different story in the United States, even during its golden age. So most of the interdisciplinary people we had in the US were imported from the German-speaking world. The few grown and worked in multiple fields had at least learned from those German speakers, just as John Bardeen did, as I showed, or Linus Pauling, who did his doctoral work in Germany and then came back. So these people were heavily influenced by the German-speaking system. So I think it's very important to have some interdisciplinary researchers, and even in the golden age of the United States, there were not that many. Now, of course, we need people who are specialized. We need specialized to go do this specialized thing, that specialized thing. But I really think that the modern system should encourage at least some small percentage of students to study multiple disciplines, get really good at multiple disciplines. And that way they can make contributions to multiple fields, or they can take what they've learned in one field and apply it to another field. Or they can use the fact that they have a broader view to tell everybody else in the field, hey, don't go down that path. That looks like a dead end. Go this way instead. This looks more promising. And so have some students, some small fraction who are multidisciplinary. But I think that everybody, all students, all scientists, should really learn how to communicate their work clearly with other scientists and with the public, and be able to cross-pollinate ideas that way. The sixth factor is that there were certain level scientific managers who strongly supported innovation. And borrowing a term from history, I call these enlightened despots. So, like an enlightened despot monarch in history, they had a lot of power for one person, maybe too much power for one person, but they used that power not to enrich themselves, but to try to help their country or help their organization, help the world. And in the German-speaking world, there were a bunch of these people. Arguably the most important was this guy, Friedrich Althoff, who really helped to set up this whole system and trained a lot of the other despots around him. What all these despots had in common is that they all had very strong, very direct support of very high-ranking authorities above them, sometimes even at the very top of the government. And they also had a very keen eye for finding the best early revolutionary innovators and innovations. And once they found those, because they had strong direct support from above, these enlightened despots were able to offer long-term steady employment and funding to what they thought were the best people and the best projects. So allow them to succeed if they were going to. This was the German-speaking world. In the golden age of the United States, there was something extremely similar. These were some of the enlightened despots here. And of course, everybody will recognize Oppenheimer and Groves here. Very good example of this. In my opinion, perhaps the most important person was Vannevar Bush, who helped to set up the Manhattan Project as well as many other things. And he was kind of the godfather of this entire system. But again, these people had strong direct authority from above. In the case of Vannevar Bush and Leslie Groves, went all the way up to the president. They had a very good eye for the kind of innovators and innovations they wanted to support, and they had the funding. They had the opportunities to offer long-term employment to whoever they wanted below them. So I think we could learn a lot from that nowadays. The system nowadays is quite different. So peer review is used for virtually all funding decisions, virtually all employment decisions in research nowadays. And peer review is good to weed out bad ideas, but it's very difficult to get a peer review committee to all agree on some really new scientist, some really new scientific idea. They're so entrenched in the status quo. So even if we still have peer review, I think that at least some fraction of research funding should be allotted to enlightened despots. And you give them the funding, you give them the authority to just go find good people and go find good ideas and fund that. They are able to fund anyone they want for a number of years, and they would not be required that every one of those investments would necessarily pay off. Some will pay off, some won't, but the ones that do pay off could really change the world. A real question is how you find the best people to put in those positions of enlightened despots. How do you find a good Leslie Groves? And in the past, some of the despots were handpicked by the earlier despots. Vannevar Bush handpicked so many people in the US system. Some people just kind of accidentally arrived at their position by good luck and general force of will, again like Leslie Groves. But best methods to find and select those people nowadays, that's kind of an open question. Another thing that came out of my research is that these enlightened despots often worked in pairs, and they worked extremely well in pairs. And so a good example would be back here to Groves and Oppenheimer. So they worked as a pair, as a team, and Groves was generally focused upward on the problems above. Can we get enough funding? Can we stop interference from somebody else? And Oppenheimer was generally focused downward, the project below him, making sure all that ran smoothly. But there have been many examples of this kind of pairing in history. Another is Wernher von Braun, who was generally focused downward on the rocket programs. When he was in the United States, above him was James Webb, focused upward. And when von Braun was in Germany, above him was Walter Dornberger, focused upward. So those are some very important lessons. Where peer review is still used, I think it should be used in a blind fashion. So the peer reviewers are not awarding funding based on, who that researcher is or where they're located, but they're really awarding it based on who has the best ideas or not. And there are some good books arguing this by Donald Braben, who supported research in the UK. The seventh factor is what I call systems analysis. And this was practiced widely throughout the German-speaking world. Its principles were really articulated by people like Fritz Zwicky and Theodor von Karman. But the general idea is that you kind of identify a range of problems that you might like to solve. And then out of that range of problems, you break it down into different categories of problems, break those down into even subcategories of problems, and then start to rule things out. Say, well, I can't work on this subcategory of problems because it would take too much money to do that. I can't work on this because that's just too hard. But you narrow it down and you find which of these promising problems you can work on, and then apply the same sort of systems analysis to the solutions. So think about all possible solutions for a given problem and subdivide it into categories, subcategories, and then start ruling out solutions. Well, this solution will never work. This will have the funding to do, but you identify the most promising solutions and you pursue those. And again, this was widely done in the early German-speaking world. It was also widely done in the mid-20th century US. A lot of think tanks used these methods, and the US nuclear program used these methods. So I think that kind of systems analysis should be taught and practiced in schools nowadays. And I think that the decision makers in government and industry and academia could use this kind of systems analysis to make sure they're pursuing the most important problems and not the least important problems, and to make sure they're pursuing the most important potential solutions for those problems. Even individual scientists can use the systems analysis to make sure they're staying on track, they're headed in the most promising direction. The eighth factor was limited natural resources. And for all of its history, the German-speaking world was extremely limited in terms of how many natural resources they had and what resources they had. And because of that limitation, it really forced them to be innovative in making the most of what they had. So they developed synthetic dyes, and then many of those synthetic dye molecules went on and became very promising drug molecules and other things. They developed a way to synthesize ammonia for fertilizer and explosives, synthetic rubber, plastics, synthetic explosives, synthetic foods and preservatives for foods, even synthetic blood plasma, and biotechnology to synthesize all kinds of things. So this innovation was driven by their limitation in resources. Now, this is one area where the United States had a very different experience. The United States generally had abundant natural resources on its own territory. And even for the things we didn't have, we could easily import those from around the world, from whoever did have them. You want Congolese uranium, you order Congolese uranium and it shows up on your shore. So the United States really did not have this kind of pressure to develop synthetic processes. Now, at the end of World War II, the US kind of inherited the German-developed synthetic processes, and it certainly used those, but there's really not been much incentive to develop new processes after that. But of course, nowadays, we worry so much about limited natural resources worldwide, about climate change, pollution, accumulation of waste. I think it would be very advantageous if we let those global limitations drive innovation again. And that can be done through giving proper incentives, government incentives and industrial incentives for innovative solutions to these problems. The ninth point was international rivalry. And the German-speaking world was just constantly afraid of, its life, basically its existence throughout its history. So every so often there'd be some major war, including World Wars I, World Wars II. And so rivalry would turn heated in the wars. But even between the wars, there was fierce industrial competition. Who was going to sell the most stuff? So competition between the German-speaking world and the British, the French, the US, and so forth. And this extreme level of rivalry, of competition, was a strong driver of innovation. They had to be as innovative as possible to have the best chances of winning these trade battles or trying to win the wars. Again, the story is somewhat different in the United States. There was less impending sense of international rivalry in the US for most of its history. And so there was less need for innovation. Now, things did really heat up approaching World War II. So in response to that, Vannevar Bush and others founded the NDRC and OSRD around 1940. From then on in World War II, it really drove innovation, this sense of competing with the Axis powers. And then even after 1945, the very heated competition with the Soviet Union during the Cold War drove innovation. Then around 1970-ish, the Cold War relaxed. And there was the strategic arms limitation talks, the SALT talks. There were other arms limitation treaties at the same time. In the space race, which had been so competitive for so long, the United States landed people on the moon. The Soviet Union did not contest that, did not say, well, we'll be the first ones to land people on Mars. So we continued space activities, but at a much lower level after that. And so there was much less pressure compelling innovation in the United States. There was still, some desire for innovation, but it gradually decreased over time. And then there was another sea change when the Soviet Union fell apart entirely. So there's really less sense that we need innovation for competition in the United States nowadays. We have a lot of competition, industrial competition, military competition, but in my opinion, we really don't feel the kind of pressure driving innovation that we should or that we used to. So those factors could be implemented in the modern world in a more peaceful fashion without having World War III or anything. And so I think we could have peaceful economic rivalry. In fact, you could even do it within a country. So just as we have rival sports teams within a country, you could have rival high-tech centers within a country. And those could compete to see which one can get the best scientists, just like who gets the best athletes, who gets the best projects, who gets the research funding. And that could really drive innovation even within a country and certainly between countries. So there were a couple of MIT professors who wrote a whole book about that. The final point is what I call industrial unity of purpose. In the German-speaking world, their companies were so afraid of foreign competition or so afraid of losing the next war, they were much less afraid of other rival companies in the German-speaking world. So each company was not really so afraid it was going to get backstabbed by the company next door, and not really so busy trying to backstab the company next door. They were all just trying to, save their country against international competitors. So as a result, the chemical industry in the German-speaking world was fairly unified. The electrical industry was fairly unified. The aircraft industry was fairly unified. The automotive industry was fairly unified. And these relatively unified industries would take some of their money and not only do their own research, but also dole out some of their money to universities, to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes, now called the Max Planck Institutes, and give money to those universities and get innovations back. Very similar story in the United States. So because the pressure, the rivalry with the Soviet Union during the Cold War was so intense, the weapons industry, all these various companies, were fairly unified. They weren't trying to backstab each other. They were all on the same team, all coordinated by the Defense Department. Similarly, the space industry was all coordinated by NASA or the Air Force. The nuclear industry, as you guys well know, was all coordinated by the AEC or DOE. So all different labs and companies all working together. And then in electronics, most of that was really consolidated at AT&T Bell Labs. So without lots of competition and backstabbing, but Bell Labs working as the preeminent place to develop transistors and things. I think we really need to relearn those lessons nowadays. Companies in the United States have learned a bad lesson instead. They've learned that if you spend a lot of your own money doing research to invent transistors, or spend a lot of your own money to invent lasers, pharmaceuticals, personal computers, smartphones, then rival companies within the United States can just turn around, take that product, and sell their own version of it. And so the lesson that companies have learned is don't be the dumb company that spends all your own money developing this stuff, spending money to develop this stuff. Be the smart company that doesn't spend any money on research and instead just steals other people's research once they develop it. It's a very bad lesson to learn. So I think that this could be reversed with appropriate policies nowadays. So through tax policies, patent policies, regulation, and so forth, give enough incentive to companies that they should do their own research. And once they do it, they can really profit from their own research. Now, there are a few other lessons along the way. One thing that really stands out from all these historical examples is that organizations treated their own employees as a long-term resource to cultivate, not short-term disposable components that they could swap out. And that's very different than nowadays. Also, historically, these organizations evaluated their scientists based on the actual quality of their work, the importance of their work, not just based on the numerical value, the quantity of how many publications they made or where they published their work. There are lessons for universities in all of this. If you look at these examples, like from the biographies of the German-speaking scientists, teaching is extremely important, and teaching is kind of a very low priority at many modern US universities, but teaching was extremely important back then and had a huge payoff in terms of the quality of young scientists that it produced. At companies, these older systems had leaders that were really looking to the long term for their company. They wanted their company to be as successful as possible long term. They were willing to spend several years developing a transistor, developing a new drug to do that. And nowadays, the leaders at companies are often really focused just on what's our stock price going to be tomorrow, or what are we selling for a product next year. And then for government labs, the government labs in the US were generally established during World War II or immediately after World War II. And they were focused on whatever the most revolutionary problems were at that time, like nuclear energy. But those problems have long since been reduced to practice. So I think we need to reorient the government labs on whatever the most important new problems are. Now, there are other factors that could be investigated. I named those, I named 10, but there are a small number of other things that could be investigated if somebody out there has the time and energy. So we could look at these various factors in the United States, in the early German-speaking world. We could look at other places. I mean, what was going on in France or Japan or someplace to promote innovation, and people certainly should study those things. And of course, I wouldn't want to rule out completely new approaches. So I like to borrow historically successful approaches whenever possible. But there might be entirely new approaches to innovation as well. So anyway, that is my spiel, that I think there's a lot we can learn from this early German-speaking system and from the US. In particular, I've identified these 10 different areas. And I think there are ways to implement all 10 of these factors in the modern world. And if we could do that, hopefully it would improve, increase the amount of innovation that we have nowadays. And the innovations that came out of these systems, think about, and we're still using the, nuclear energy that was developed at Oak Ridge. We're still using the transistors that were developed back, 80 years ago, still using technologies from 100 years ago, various pharmaceuticals and things. So if we really have revolutionary innovation now, it would be to innovate products that could be quite useful, say, even a century from now. So I think people should think in those terms. What would be a revolutionary innovation that would be a very important part of life 100 years from now? And sci-fi is a good way to think about this. You don't necessarily have to invent the whole spaceship, but just kind of, picture yourself wandering around the spaceship and, pick any small part. What would a coffee maker 100 years from now look like? How could you improve greatly over the current state of coffee makers or anything else? So if people are interested, here is some reading material. What I've talked about is explained in much more detail in chapters 10 to 12 of my book. You can download that for free from our website. And here are some of the other books and sources that I cited. So if you're curious, you can go to my website and download this and download a lot of other stuff.
Wow.
All right.
Wow. Todd, let me ask you a question. What are you're talking about innovation. You're talking about, the way things used to be compared to where they are now. What are your thoughts on Elon Musk and the work that he's doing?
I think some of the work is important. I think, yeah, you may have found a counterexample where the press does give attention to that. But I would contend that the press is not giving attention to the actual scientists and engineers who are designing and building those electric cars or those rockets. The press is giving attention to the person in charge of the company.
Right.
And maybe he deserves attention, but if you compare to the olden days, you'd have the actual scientists on the cover of Time magazine, or actual scientists lauded in the German-speaking press. And so nowadays, yes, we do pay attention to some billionaires as well as sports stars and things, but we're still not really paying that much attention to the scientists and the engineers.
Okay. All right.
Good point. And again, your book is available online. WriterInstitute.org will get anyone there that is interested in it. You can download it or you can read it online. And there is a wealth of information there. We've had Todd on, I don't know, a number of times, and each time he's brought us a different aspect of what he's done in his research to bring out the insights like he did today on how innovation took place in various parts of our history, and then what we could learn from that to apply today. So, Todd, thank you very much for all the work that you've done and pulling this together and making it available free to anyone that wants to take advantage of it.
Thank you.
All right, very good. Ray, who do we have coming up next time?
Well, again, we're going to bring an old friend back. Katie Watt is going to come to us, and Katie, of course, is with Explore Oak Ridge, and we'll be focusing on tourism. We'll talk a bit about what has happened since the Oppenheimer movie came out and what we want to do to take even better advantage of the publicity associated with anything that's going on that has a connotation that we can tie to Oak Ridge. And of course, one of the things she's proudest of are these little 3-minute videos from Katie the Kayatron girl. And they're taking a slightly different approach in the future to what they're doing with her. And I think it'll be good to have our audience catch up with what Katie's doing and what she's planning from Explore Oak Ridge.
All right, very good. All right, folks, thanks for watching. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new Hidden History.